Everyone trusted him. That trust is exactly how the crimes lasted so long. For years, this man stood at the pulpit and spoke about forgiveness. What no one knew was what he was hiding. For decades, John Geoghan was not a name spoken aloud. In parish records, he appeared as a priest, transferred from one church to another. In internal files, his movements were documented with calm language: reassignment, medical leave, administrative adjustment. To the families who trusted him, he was a man of God. To the children who encountered him, he was something else entirely. And to the institution that knew what he was doing, he was a problem to be managed, not a crime to be reported. John Geoghan was ordained as a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Boston in the early 1960s. He served in multiple parishes across Massachusetts over the course of 3 decades. On the surface, his career looked ordinary, quiet, stable, faithful. But behind closed doors, complaints followed him like a shadow. As early as the 1970s, church officials received reports that Geoghan had sexually abused children. The accusations were not vague. Parents came forward. Victims spoke. Concerns were documented. What did not happen is what defines this case. There were no police reports. There were no warnings to congregations. There were no public consequences. Instead, Geoghan was moved, again and again, from one parish to another, often into communities with schools, youth programs, and altar servers. Each transfer came without disclosure. Each new assignment placed him in contact with fresh victims. The church kept records, but not the kind meant to protect children. Internal correspondence later revealed that church leadership knew Geoghan posed a danger. Psychologists consulted by the church warned that he was likely to Settlements were quietly paid to families who agreed to remain silent. Files were sealed. Complaints were labeled resolved. Resolved meant hidden. By the time the truth began to surface publicly, Geoghan had been accused of abusing over 130 children, making him one of the most prolific abusers in modern American history. For the victims, the abuse often followed a similar pattern. Geoghan targeted boys, many from working-class or immigrant Catholic families. He used his authority to gain access, offering rides, private meetings, overnight trips. The collar protected him. Parents trusted him because the church told them to. Children did not have language for what was happening. When some tried to speak, they were dismissed, blamed, or simply not believed. Others stayed silent for decades, carrying the damage alone. Inside the archdiocese, the response was not ignorance, it was strategy. Documents later made public showed that high-ranking officials, including Cardinal Bernard Law, were aware of the allegations. Instead of reporting Geoghan to law enforcement, they approved transfers. When pressure mounted, Geoghan was sent to church-run treatment centers, not to remove him from access to children, but to manage the risk quietly. Records were kept internally. Law enforcement was kept out. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. In 1994, after years of abuse and growing complaints, Geoghan was finally removed from parish work. But even then, the church did not alert the public to why. He was placed in a supervised residence, still under church authority. It would take another 8 years for the full truth to explode into public view. In 2002, investigative reporting by the Boston Globe uncovered thousands of internal church documents showing a systemic pattern of abuse and cover-up within the Archdiocese of Boston. Geoghan's case became the centerpiece. The records showed exactly how the institution had responded, not by stopping the abuse, but by relocating it. The revelations shook the world. Survivors came forward in waves. Many learned, for the first time, that their abuser had hurt dozens of others, and that the church had known all along. The sense of betrayal was total. John Geoghan was arrested and charged. In 2002, he was convicted of child molestation and sentenced to prison. For many victims, the conviction was not closure, it was confirmation. Confirmation that what happened was real. Confirmation that they had not imagined it. Confirmation that the church had chosen secrecy over safety. But even justice came with a cruel footnote. In 2003, while serving his sentence, John Geoghan was beaten to death in prison by another inmate. He died without ever facing trial for the vast majority of his alleged crimes. For survivors, the anger shifted direction. Geoghan was gone, but the institution remained. Cardinal Bernard Law resigned later that year, amid global outrage, but faced no criminal charges. He relocated to Rome, where he was given a prestigious ceremonial role at the Vatican. The message was unmistakable. The man who committed the abuse died in prison. The men who concealed it retired with honor. The aftermath for Boston was devastating. Parishes closed, lawsuits multiplied, settlements reached hundreds of millions of dollars, faith communities fractured, trust collapsed. For survivors, the damage was not only physical or psychological, it was existential. Many had built their lives around the church. Speaking out meant losing family support, spiritual identity, and community belonging. And for decades, the records that could have stopped the abuse had existed. They were just never used to protect children. They were used to protect the institution. This case did not reveal a single criminal. It revealed a system where documentation replaced accountability, where silence was treated as pastoral care, and where the reputation of the church outweighed the lives of the vulnerable. The records were erased, sealed, or buried in filing cabinets, but the victims remained. They remained with trauma. They remained with unanswered questions. They remained long after the institution moved on. And the most haunting truth of all is this: if the records had been handed to police instead of lawyers, if the warnings had been shared instead of hidden, if faith had not been used as a shield, hundreds of children would have been spared. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For most of his life, Maciel was treated as a miracle. To the Vatican, he was a savior of the church's future. To wealthy Catholic donors, he was a visionary builder. To politicians and popes, he was untouchable. And to the boys placed in his care, he was their abuser. Marcial de Gallardo was born in 1920 in Cotija, Mexico. From a young age, he showed an intense devotion to the Catholic Church, or at least to the power within it. By his 20s, he had founded a new religious order, the Legionaries of Christ. The timing could not have been better. The Catholic Church, facing declining influence and internal crises, embraced movements that promised discipline, obedience, and expansion. Maciel offered all three. His order emphasized absolute loyalty to leadership, secrecy, and the idea that suffering in silence was a holy act. That belief would become a weapon. Maciel positioned himself not only as founder, but as a spiritual father. He cultivated an image of humility, frailty, and sanctity. He claimed chronic illness. He presented himself as persecuted by enemies who hated the church. The narrative worked. Behind closed doors, allegations began almost immediately. As early as the 1950s, seminarians accused Maciel of sexual abuse. They described being summoned to his room under the pretense of medical needs or spiritual guidance. He claimed severe pain. He demanded obedience. He framed abuse as charity, telling victims they were helping him survive. Some boys were children. Others were teenagers preparing for priesthood. The abuse was not isolated. Multiple victims, across decades, described the same pattern, the same language, the same manipulation, the same threats. Maciel told them that speaking out would destroy the church. He warned that reporting him would be a mortal sin. And many believed him. Complaints were sent to the Vatican. Letters reached high-ranking officials. Evidence accumulated, and yet nothing happened. Instead, records were buried. Internal church files later revealed that Maciel was investigated multiple times. Each inquiry ended quietly. Each time, he emerged untouched. He continued to lead. He continued to recruit. He continued to fundraise. Money mattered. The Legionaries of Christ became one of the wealthiest religious orders in the world. Maciel cultivated relationships with powerful benefactors and political figures. His order donated heavily to Vatican causes. He was photographed with popes. He was praised publicly as a model priest. Victims watched this from the shadows. In the 1990s, several survivors attempted again to expose Maciel. They provided sworn testimony. They named witnesses. They detailed decades of abuse. Once again, the Vatican delayed. During this time, Maciel's double life grew darker. Investigations later revealed that he had fathered multiple children with different women, some of whom he also abused. He lived under aliases. He maintained secret residences. Church funds were used to support these hidden families. Still, no criminal charges were filed. The institutional response was silence. It was not until 2006, under Pope Benedict XVI, that the Vatican finally acted. Maciel was ordered to withdraw from public ministry and live a life of prayer and penance. There was no trial. There was no confession. There was no apology. He was not reported to civil authorities. He died in 2008, free from prosecution. Only after his death did the Vatican publicly acknowledge the truth. In 2010, the Church admitted that Maciel had lived a criminal life and that his victims had been telling the truth all along. The Legionaries of Christ issued a statement admitting systemic failures and acknowledging that records had been suppressed. For survivors, the damage was irreversible. Many had spent their lives battling addiction, depression, and broken faith. Some had entered the priesthood themselves, carrying unhealed trauma. Others had left religion entirely, unable to reconcile belief with betrayal. The Legionaries of Christ continues to exist today, reformed, rebranded, and monitored. But for many victims, reform feels hollow, because justice delayed is justice denied. This case exposed something global. A man accused repeatedly over 50 years was protected not because the Church lacked evidence, but because confronting him would have threatened power, money, and image at the highest levels. The records existed. The testimonies were written. The warnings were clear. They were erased, ignored, or locked away. And the victims remained. They remained while their abuser was praised. They remained while he stood beside popes. They remained while the institution chose silence over truth. And the chilling question lingers: how many crimes continue, not because no one knows, but because the cost of knowing is considered too high? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. George Pell was one of the most powerful Catholic figures of the modern era. To the Vatican, he was a financial reformer trusted to clean corruption. To Australia, he was a towering cleric who shaped national Catholic policy. To many victims, he represented something far darker, the embodiment of an institution that protected itself first. For decades, Pell's rise through the Church coincided with silence. Born in 1941 in Ballarat, Australia, George Pell was ordained in 1966. He was intelligent, authoritative, and politically skilled. Those qualities propelled him quickly upward. By the 1990s, he was one of the most influential Catholic leaders in the Southern Hemisphere. Ballarat mattered. It was a regional city with a strong Catholic presence, and later revealed to be one of the most abuse-ridden dioceses in Australia. Dozens of priests were accused of sexually abusing children over decades. Complaints circulated quietly. Files accumulated. George Pell knew this environment intimately. As a young priest and later as a senior figure, he witnessed how allegations were handled internally, discreetly, and without police involvement. Survivors later testified that the culture was clear. Loyalty to the Church came before children. The allegations against Pell himself emerged much later, but the institutional pattern was already set. In the late 1990s, Pell was appointed Archbishop of Melbourne, then later Archbishop of Sydney. He became a public defender of the Church, often criticizing what he described as exaggerated abuse claims and what he framed as anti-Catholic hostility. Behind the scenes, records told a different story. During Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, evidence showed that Pell had been aware of allegations against abusive priests and had participated in decisions that minimized consequences. In one documented case, he approved a compensation scheme that required victims to sign confidentiality agreements, preventing them from speaking publicly. The records were controlled. The narratives were managed. Then came the accusations against Pell himself. In 2017, police charged George Pell with multiple historical sexual assault offences, involving 2 choir boys in the 1990s at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. The alleged abuse took place after Mass, in a place assumed to be safe. The charges sent shockwaves through the Church. Pell denied the allegations. He claimed they were impossible. Supporters rallied around him, framing him as a victim of persecution. High-ranking clergy spoke in his defense. The Vatican granted him leave from his powerful post overseeing church finances, but did not remove him permanently. The trial became one of the most scrutinized legal cases in Australian history. In 2018, a jury convicted Pell of sexual abuse. For survivors across Australia, the verdict represented something unprecedented: accountability for a cardinal. He was sentenced to prison in 2019, but the story did not end there. In 2020, Australia's High Court unanimously overturned Pell's conviction, ruling that there was reasonable doubt. He was released after serving over a year in prison. Legally, Pell was cleared. Institutionally, he was welcomed back. The Vatican restored his standing. Supporters declared him vindicated. Public statements emphasized legal innocence, not moral accountability. For survivors, the outcome was devastating. Many said the ruling reinforced a painful truth. Even when victims speak, even when a conviction is secured, power can still reverse the outcome. The emotional toll on survivors who had testified, reliving trauma under global scrutiny, was immense. But Pell's legacy extends beyond the courtroom. The Royal Commission concluded that systemic failures within the Catholic Church, including during Pell's leadership, allowed abuse to continue unchecked. Records were withheld. Complaints were handled internally. Victims were silenced through legal and financial pressure. The Commission found that protecting reputation had consistently taken priority over child safety. George Pell died in 2023. At the time of his death, reactions were sharply divided. Some praised his service. Others mourned what they described as justice, never fully realized. What remains uncontested is this: the Church had records. The Church had warnings. The Church had opportunities to act. And again, it chose institutional survival over transparency. The erasure in this case was not always physical destruction of files, it was procedural. Complaints reclassified, testimony narrowed, accountability delayed until evidence aged and memories faded. Time became the shield. For victims, time did not heal, it compounded. They remained with unanswered questions. They remained with public doubt. They remained while the institution closed ranks. And the chilling lesson endures: when records are buried long enough, truth becomes harder to prove, and power becomes easier to protect. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments.
In the early 2000s, Bishop Eddie Long stood at the height of his power. From the pulpit of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, his sermons thundered across television screens, reaching millions. He preached discipline, family values, and above all, sexual purity. His church, one of the largest megachurches in the United States, boasted over 25,000 members, athletes, politicians, and celebrities among them. To his followers, Long was a man of God, a spiritual father who fought against moral decay. But behind his tailored suits and carefully crafted image, a darker truth was waiting to surface, one that would destroy his ministry, devastate his congregation, and reveal the hypocrisy hidden behind the cross. Eddie Long wasn't always a spiritual giant. Born in North Carolina in 1953, he grew up in a modest home, the son of factory workers. His charisma and drive carried him through college and into ministry, where he quickly distinguished himself with fiery sermons and a confident stage presence. By the time he became senior pastor at New Birth in 1987, the church had just 300 members. Within a decade, Long had transformed it into a spiritual empire, a place where faith met fame. He preached prosperity and power, that God rewarded the faithful with success. Under his leadership, the church grew wealthy, hosting lavish conferences and attracting donations that reached into the millions. Long lived accordingly. He drove luxury cars, wore designer suits, and lived in a $1 $4 million mansion. Critics said his lifestyle contradicted his message, but his followers defended him fiercely. To them, his success was proof of divine favor. He was the embodiment of what he preached, that faith and prosperity could coexist. But his sermons about purity, particularly his outspoken opposition to homosexuality, would later take on a haunting irony. In 2004, Long organized the Youth Academy, a mentorship program for young men in his congregation. He took them under his wing, offering guidance, scholarships, and trips. For many, it seemed like a blessing, a chance for fatherless boys to be mentored by a powerful, influential pastor. But in 2010, the illusion shattered when 4 young men filed lawsuits accusing Long of sexual coercion and abuse. The news sent shockwaves through the religious world. The men claimed that Long had used his position to manipulate them, grooming them with gifts, money, and spiritual authority before engaging in sexual acts. The allegations painted a chilling pattern. Long allegedly took the young men on trips to Kenya, South Africa, and the Caribbean. He bought them cars, gave them expensive jewelry, and paid for their college tuition. The plaintiffs, Anthony Flagg, Maurice Robinson, Jamal Paris, and Spencer Legrand, described how the bishop would justify his actions as part of their spiritual connection. They said he would read Bible verses, pray with them, and tell them they were chosen. To outsiders, it seemed unimaginable that the man who railed against homosexuality from the pulpit could be living such a double life. But inside the church, whispers began to spread. Some members refused to believe it. Others quietly left, unwilling to reconcile the image of their beloved bishop with the details in the lawsuits. When the story broke publicly, Long addressed his congregation in a now infamous sermon. Dressed in a regal purple robe, he stood before thousands and declared, "I'm under attack. I am not a perfect man, but this thing I'm not guilty of." He never explicitly denied having relationships with the young men. Instead, he spoke in riddles, framing himself as a victim of persecution. The church erupted in applause. Many stood by him, convinced that the accusations were an attempt to destroy a man of faith. But outside those walls, the tide was turning. The media began digging deeper, uncovering financial records and testimonies that supported the claims of manipulation. In 2011, just months after the lawsuits were filed, Long settled the case privately with the 4 accusers. The settlement reportedly totaled more than $24 million, though the exact amount was never publicly confirmed. As part of the agreement, the men agreed not to speak publicly about the case again. The settlement wasn't an admission of guilt, but it spoke volumes. To many it confirmed what they had long feared, that the bishop who had condemned others for their sins had been living in the very darkness he preached against. The aftermath tore the church apart. Membership plummeted, donations dried up. The empire Eddie Long had built over 3 decades was collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Long continued to preach, but his influence was irreparably damaged. He appeared thinner, frailer, and more subdued. In 2016, he finally revealed he was battling an unspecified illness. A year later, in January 2017, he died at the age of 63. His death was met with mixed emotions. Sorrow from his followers, anger and vindication from those who believed justice had never been served. What makes Long's story so haunting is not just the moral fall of one man, but the betrayal of an entire community's trust. The young men who came forward were part of a generation raised to see him as a spiritual father. Their pain was compounded by a congregation that often refused to believe them. The settlements brought them silence, not closure. And in the end, no criminal charges were ever filed. The legal system couldn't convict him, but the court of public opinion rendered its verdict long before his death. The scandal also exposed deeper issues within modern church culture: how power, charisma, and money can create environments where accountability disappears. Long's position made him untouchable. His wealth insulated him. His followers defended him even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. It's a pattern that has repeated itself across denominations and decades, faith used as a shield for manipulation. When Long was buried, thousands attended his funeral. They called him a man of vision, a builder of churches, a leader who inspired generations. Few mentioned the lawsuits. Fewer still spoke of the young men whose lives were shattered. The image of Bishop Eddie Long, standing tall, Bible in hand, preaching fire and righteousness, remains forever tainted by the truth of what he hid behind his robes. In the end, the story of Eddie Long is not just about hypocrisy, it's about the danger of blind devotion. The power of a preacher is only as righteous as the man who wields it. And when that power becomes corrupted, faith itself becomes the victim. Millions looked to Eddie Long for guidance. What they found instead was a man who built an empire on purity and destroyed it with deceit. For years, Ted Haggard stood as one of the most powerful voices in American Christianity, a man who could command stadiums, influence politicians, and move entire congregations to tears. As the founder of New Life Church in Colorado Springs and president of the National Association of Evangelicals, his reach extended far beyond the pulpit. To millions, he was a moral compass, a preacher who stood firmly for family values, purity, and the sanctity of marriage. But in November 2006, the man who claimed to speak for God was exposed for living a double life that shocked not just his followers, but the entire nation. Behind the sermons and the smiles, Ted Haggard was living a secret that would destroy his empire and reveal how power, repression, and hypocrisy can coexist beneath the cross. Ted Haggard's rise was meteoric. Born in Indiana in 1956, he came from a conservative Christian family. He often spoke of his teenage years as a time of struggle, haunted by feelings he didn't understand. Feelings of attraction toward other men that conflicted with everything his faith taught him. He claimed that God had healed him, and that his calling was to help others overcome sin. That belief became the foundation of his ministry. In 1985, with his wife Gail by his side, Haggard founded New Life Church in his basement with just a handful of members. Over the next 2 decades, it exploded into one of America's most influential megachurches, drawing over 14,000 worshipers every Sunday. Haggard's charisma was magnetic. He was a natural storyteller, blending humor, passion, and theology in a way that made his message feel both personal and powerful. His sermons weren't just about faith, they were about victory, discipline, and moral clarity. He preached that homosexuality was a sin, that marriage was sacred, and that America needed to return to biblical values. He met regularly with President George W. Bush's administration and was even dubbed pastor to the presidents. The New York Times once described him as the most influential evangelical in America. But as his public influence grew, so did his private torment. In November 2006, the facade cracked. A Denver-based male escort named Mike Jones went public with shocking allegations. He claimed that over a period of 3 years, he had been paid by Haggard for sex, and that Haggard regularly used methamphetamine during their encounters. The story hit the media like a thunderclap. For many, it was impossible to believe. Ted Haggard, the outspoken opponent of same-sex relationships, accused of hiring a male sex worker. But as details emerged, the picture became undeniable. Jones had kept voicemails, text messages, and phone records. One voicemail, in which Haggard's distinctive voice requested more of that stuff, referring to meth, was broadcast nationwide. The voice was unmistakable. At first, Haggard denied everything. He called the accusations ridiculous and claimed he didn't even know who Mike Jones was. But within days, as evidence mounted, his story began to unravel. In a letter to his congregation, Haggard admitted to buying meth, though he insisted he never used it, and vaguely confessed to sexual immorality. The truth was darker than his carefully worded apology suggested. The Board of Overseers at New Life Church confronted him privately, and according to later reports, he broke down and confessed to a lifelong sexual struggle. Within a week, Ted Haggard was forced to resign as both senior pastor and president of the National Association of Evangelicals. The fall was swift and devastating. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of religious influence was suddenly in exile. Reporters camped outside his home. His congregation, stunned and heartbroken, wept openly during Sunday services. The church he had built from nothing was now scrambling to contain the damage. Haggard and his family retreated from public life, while church elders arranged for him to undergo an intensive restoration program, a mix of therapy, prayer, and spiritual counseling intended to cure his homosexuality. But the truth couldn't be prayed away. In 2009, 3 years after his scandal broke, new allegations surfaced. Another young man, a volunteer at New Life Church, came forward claiming that Haggard had engaged in inappropriate sexual conduct with him. The church quietly settled the matter, paying the man an undisclosed sum. Though Haggard denied the allegations, his credibility was long gone. The image of the confident preacher who had once spoken out against sin was forever replaced by the image of a man undone by his own secrets. After years in exile, Haggard attempted a comeback. In 2010, he founded a small church called St. James in Colorado Springs. He described it as a church for broken people, a place where no one would be judged. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The congregation was tiny compared to his former empire, but Haggard seemed content. He gave interviews admitting his past, saying he had been a sinner in need of grace. Yet even in his contrition, the contradictions remained. He still avoided calling himself gay or bisexual, instead framing his desires as a temptation that Satan used against me. It was clear that even after his fall, Haggard was still wrestling with the same inner conflict that had fueled his deception in the first place. The scandal had broader consequences beyond Haggard himself. It forced the evangelical movement to confront uncomfortable truths about repression, sexuality, and hypocrisy. For years, Haggard had been a leading voice in campaigns opposing gay marriage and LGBTQ rights. His downfall wasn't just personal. It exposed the moral contradictions at the heart of an entire movement that preached condemnation, but offered no space for honesty. Many LGBTQ Christians pointed to Haggard as proof of what happens when faith becomes a cage, when leaders are taught to hate the very part of themselves they cannot change. In later years, Haggard would admit that his downfall was a product of shame and denial. He said he lived for decades terrified that his true self would be discovered. That fear, he claimed, drove him deeper into secrecy, creating a double life that eventually collapsed under its own weight. "I asked God to take it away," he said in an interview years later, "but it never went away. I thought I was winning the war inside me, but I was just losing slower." Ted Haggard's story remains one of the most infamous in American religious history, not because of the scandal itself, but because of what it revealed about power, repression, and the cost of pretending to be perfect. His fall from grace was public, humiliating, and irreversible. Yet even today he continues to preach, albeit to a fraction of his former audience, still seeking redemption for the life he once hid. For his followers, the betrayal was profound. They had believed in his words, shaped their morals around his teachings, and defended his integrity. When the truth emerged, it left not just a broken man but a shattered faith community, one forced to reckon with how easily charisma can conceal corruption. Ted Haggard's life serves as a cautionary tale. When a preacher builds his ministry on suppression instead of honesty, the lie eventually consumes the man behind the pulpit. And in Haggard's case, that lie took down not only a man but an entire movement built on fear of the very truth he embodied. He called himself a prophet, a chosen messenger of God. To his followers, Tony Alamo was more than a preacher. He was a savior in a dark world, a man who claimed to hear the divine voice and promised eternal life to anyone who obeyed him. But what lay beneath his holy words was a nightmare of manipulation, greed, and unthinkable abuse. Tony Alamo built an empire of fear disguised as faith, and behind the closed doors of his ministry, he created a world where religion was weaponized to control, exploit, and destroy. Tony Alamo's story began like many cult leaders before him, with charm, conviction, and the perfect pitch for salvation. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri in 1934, Alamo moved to California in the 1960s chasing fame as a pop singer. When that failed, he reinvented himself as a man of God, claiming that Jesus had appeared to him and called him to spread his word. It was during this rebirth that he met Susan Lipowitz, a woman as ambitious and controlling as he was. Together, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969, headquartered in Hollywood. What began as a small street ministry for runaways and addicts quickly grew into something far more sinister. The Alamos promised spiritual freedom but demanded absolute obedience. Their followers were told to sever ties with their families, surrender their possessions, and dedicate their lives to the church. Those who questioned them were shamed, beaten, or excommunicated. By the mid-1970s, the foundation had relocated to Dyer, Arkansas, where it blossomed into a self-contained community. The Alamos preached daily, broadcast sermons, and ran businesses ranging from construction to clothing manufacturing, all using unpaid labor from their followers. The money poured in, and Tony's control deepened. When Susan died in 1982, something in Tony snapped. He declared that she would be resurrected and ordered followers to pray over her corpse for 6 months, refusing to bury her until the stench became unbearable. He began referring to himself as both prophet and God, claiming Susan spoke to him from heaven. He used fear and scripture to justify every cruelty. Women were told to submit, children were told to obey without question, and anyone who doubted was labeled possessed by demons. Over the next 2 decades, Tony Alamo's ministry evolved into a cult-like compound governed by violence and paranoia. Former followers later described beatings with wooden boards, starvation punishments, and forced labor. Children worked long hours in church businesses, were pulled from school, and taught that the outside world was evil. Alamo's sermons became more apocalyptic and erratic, filled with rants against Catholics, Jews, and the U.S. government. He claimed to be preparing for the end times, building what he called God's kingdom on earth. But behind this divine facade, he was living in depravity, taking underage girls as his spiritual wives. In the 1990s, reports began surfacing that Alamo was forcing young girls, some as young as 9, into marriages with him. He justified it by citing biblical patriarchs who had many wives. Survivors later revealed that he would hold mock wedding ceremonies, declaring the girls his brides and subjecting them to sexual abuse. Parents who resisted were punished, sometimes beaten in front of their children. Federal authorities began investigating, but Alamo was adept at evasion. In 1994, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of hiding millions in church funds. When he was released in 1998, he rebuilt his ministry, smaller but just as dangerous. His compound in Fouke, Arkansas, became the center of renewed allegations of abuse. Former followers who escaped spoke of nightmarish conditions, of children whipped for minor offenses, of forced fasts that lasted days, and of women kept in fear of eternal damnation. In 2008, the FBI raided the compound. What they found confirmed the horrifying rumors. Evidence of child sexual abuse, physical punishment, and control so total it bordered on psychological slavery. 6 women came forward describing how Alamo had taken them as child brides and assaulted them repeatedly. Some were as young as 8 when the abuse began. During his 2009 trial, prosecutors called him a predator who used the Bible as a weapon. The survivors told harrowing stories of manipulation, how Alamo convinced them that sexual acts were holy and that disobedience would bring God's wrath. One victim testified that he forced her to marry him when she was just 9, taking her on trips where he would rape her in hotel rooms. Another said he told her she was chosen by God and would be cursed if she ever told anyone. The courtroom heard hours of testimony detailing not just sexual abuse, but decades of terror inflicted under the guise of religion. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tony Alamo on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called him beyond redemption. Even then, Alamo showed no remorse. In his statement, he railed against the government, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. To the end, he believed himself untouchable, a prophet above man's law. Tony Alamo died in 2017 in a North Carolina prison at the age of 82. His death closed a chapter in one of the darkest sagas of American evangelical history. But for his victims, the trauma lingers. Many former members still struggle to rebuild their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Some remain estranged from family members who are still loyal to Alamo's teachings. Even after his death, remnants of his ministry continued online, spreading his sermons and insisting he was framed by the government. What makes Tony Alamo's story especially chilling is how he turned faith, something meant to heal and uplift, into a tool for domination. He convinced parents to surrender their children, turned prayer into punishment, and built wealth on the backs of those he enslaved spiritually and physically. His followers believed they were serving God. In truth, they were serving a man who saw himself as one. Alamo's legacy is not one of faith, but of fear, a cautionary reminder that charisma without conscience becomes tyranny. He wore religion like armor, using it to deflect every accusation, manipulate every heart, and justify every sin. And yet, for decades, the world looked away, blinded by his rhetoric, comforted by the illusion that a man who preached the Bible could not possibly be evil. But evil often hides behind the holiest masks, and Tony Alamo's was one that promised salvation, but delivered hell instead. Creflo was once a relatively unknown preacher in Atlanta, Georgia, quietly leading a small congregation. Today he is one of the wealthiest and most controversial figures in modern American Christianity, a living embodiment of the prosperity gospel, the belief that faith and financial donations will bring personal wealth. To his followers, Dollar is a man of God, a shepherd guiding his flock to both spiritual and material abundance. To his critics, he is a living testament to how easily faith can be exploited when charisma, wealth, and religious authority collide. Born in College Park, Georgia in 1962, Creflo grew up in a middle-class African-American family. He attended Morehouse College and quickly became known for his speaking ability and leadership skills. In the 1980s, he founded World Changers Church International, which began in a small rented storefront in College Park. Early on, Dollar preached a simple message: God rewards faithfulness with material blessings. Those who tithed and contributed to the ministry would see their finances multiply, health improve, and lives transform. While some saw this message as empowering, it quickly morphed into a system that encouraged giving not out of devotion, but out of expectation of tangible returns. By the 1990s, Dollar's congregation had grown into the tens of thousands. He purchased a 16-acre campus in College Park to accommodate the swelling crowds. Television broadcasts expanded his reach beyond Atlanta, turning him into a nationally recognized preacher. His sermons were electrifying, blending motivational speaking with biblical teaching, appealing to the hopes and dreams of those struggling economically. And like other prosperity preachers, Dollar's promise was personal: give to the church, and God will give back. But as his fame grew, so did the scrutiny. Critics began asking questions about the source of his wealth. reports revealed that Dollar had amassed a personal fortune exceeding $27 million, including a private jet valued at $12 million. While he defended his wealth as a tool for ministry, skeptics pointed out that his lavish lifestyle, luxury cars, private schooling for his children, multiple properties, contrasted sharply with the economic realities of many of his parishioners. Dollar argued that the jet allowed him to save souls globally, but for many, it symbolized a more troubling truth. The line between ministry and personal profit had blurred. In 2012, controversy intensified when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published an investigative report on the use of church funds. They questioned the ethics of using donations for personal expenses, particularly the purchase of the private jet. Dollar defended the expenditure, claiming the jet was essential for his worldwide ministry and was a biblical investment in the salvation of souls. Church members echoed his defense, citing testimonies of miraculous financial turnarounds and blessings in their own lives. But outside observers saw it differently. A preacher living in extravagance while asking for donations from congregants struggling to pay rent and bills. Dollar's messaging also drew criticism for its psychological impact. He frequently urged followers to sow a seed, donate money as an act of faith that would yield divine returns. The language was compelling and persuasive. Vulnerable individuals desperate for financial relief often gave beyond their means. Critics compared it to a financial gamble disguised as spiritual devotion, preying on hope, fear, and belief. In some cases, people went into debt attempting to give as instructed, believing God would reward them later. Despite the scrutiny, Dollar's influence persisted. He expanded World Changers Church to multiple campuses, and his television broadcasts reached millions each week. By carefully framing wealth as a sign of God's favor and poverty as a result of spiritual deficiency, he maintained authority and loyalty among his followers. Conferences, book sales, and television programs became additional revenue streams, further entrenching the prosperity model. Dollar's personal life also raised eyebrows. While he preached marital fidelity and spiritual discipline, reports surfaced over the years about accusations of extravagant spending on family and associates, fostering a culture that seemed more focused on material accumulation than spiritual growth. Investigative journalists questioned whether the power structure within his church allowed unchecked authority, raising the same concerns familiar in other megachurch scandals. Despite controversy, Creflo Dollar has remained a prominent figure in American Christianity. He continues to preach, teach, and broadcast, emphasizing prosperity theology while defending the necessity of his lifestyle for ministry purposes. In interviews, he frames criticism as envy or misunderstanding, asserting that God blesses the faithful with abundance, and that he, as a minister, merely enjoys the reward of obedience to divine purpose. The story of Creflo Dollar highlights the modern tension between faith and fortune. While he has undoubtedly inspired devotion, charity, and hope among millions, his life also demonstrates how religious authority can be leveraged to accumulate wealth under the guise of divine blessing. For followers, the promise of God's favor comes with real financial and emotional stakes. For outsiders, the spectacle is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of charisma, the vulnerability of belief, and the ways in which the line between ministry and personal enrichment can vanish entirely. Dollar's empire continues, a testament to the enduring appeal of prosperity preaching. For every supporter who testifies of God's blessings, there is another questioning whether faith has been commodified, whether miracles are simply marketing, and whether the smiling preacher on the stage represents divine guidance or human ambition cloaked in holiness. The tension remains unresolved. a shadow that stretches over every megachurch with gilded pulpits and televised promises. Creflo Dollar's story serves as a stark reminder. When wealth and faith collide, devotion can be both a blessing and a trap, and the man behind the mask of piety may not always be the shepherd he appears to be. Jack Van Impe, known to millions as the Walking Bible, built a global following preaching the imminence of the end times. Born in 1931 in Royal Oak, Michigan, Van Impe became famous for his televised program Jack Van Impe Presents, where he would read scripture nonstop for hours, linking biblical prophecy to contemporary events. His mission seemed clear: warn the world of impending doom and urge repentance. But while he preached urgency, morality, and piety, Van Impe's ministry quietly amassed wealth through donations, real estate investments, and merchandising, revealing a troubling intersection between faith, fear, and financial gain. Jack Van Impe grew up during the Great Depression, witnessing poverty and instability that left a deep impression on him. He claimed that divine intervention guided his path into ministry. By the late 1950s, he began evangelizing in Detroit, combining fire and brimstone preaching with charismatic delivery. His sermons often focused on prophecy, the signs of the end times, the second coming of Christ, and global conspiracies foretold in the book of Revelation. Audiences were captivated by his fervor and meticulous scriptural knowledge. Van Impe's ministry expanded rapidly with the rise of television evangelism. By the 1970s, he was broadcasting across the United States, reaching millions of homes each week. His preaching was relentless. He would link earthquakes, wars, and political events to biblical prophecy, convincing viewers that judgment was near and only the faithful would be spared. This combination of fear, authority, and biblical scholarship made him an influential figure in evangelical circles. However, Van Impe's empire was not just spiritual. He created an extensive merchandising operation: books, DVDs, prophecy charts, and subscription-based newsletters. Donations from viewers financed his production facilities, luxury homes, and travel for international ministry work. Critics argued that while he warned about the dangers of greed and sin, he personally benefited from a system built on fear and urgency. Followers were encouraged to give generously as a demonstration of faith, sometimes at the expense of their own financial stability. In 2009, Van Impe's ministry faced scrutiny when reports surfaced about the scale of his wealth. Federal records and investigative journalism revealed that his nonprofit organization reported millions in annual donations, yet he personally enjoyed a lifestyle far beyond the average American. Critics accused him of exploiting apocalyptic fears for profit, while supporters defended him, arguing that his resources were necessary to spread God's message worldwide. The tension between spiritual mission and material accumulation became even more pronounced in the final years of his ministry. Jack Van Impe continued to preach about the coming apocalypse with unrelenting intensity while expanding his media reach, creating a lucrative enterprise under the banner of religious urgency. His television programs often featured direct appeals for donations, reinforcing the perception that financial contributions were a spiritual imperative. Despite the controversy, Van Impe maintained a loyal following until his death in January 2020 at the age of 88. Congregants mourned the loss of a man they believed had dedicated his life to saving souls, while outsiders questioned whether his preaching had been as much about salvation as it was about sustaining a prosperous ministry. His death prompted reflection on the power of media, fear, and faith in the hands of a charismatic leader. Jack Van Impe's story is a cautionary tale about the thin line between devotion and exploitation. While he educated and inspired millions through his meticulous study of Scripture and passionate delivery, he also profited from the fears and anxieties of his followers. The empire he built demonstrates how charisma, media savvy, and spiritual authority can intersect with financial gain, creating a system where faith becomes both a source of hope and a vehicle for profit. Ultimately, Van Impe's legacy is dual, one of devout scholarship and dedication to biblical prophecy, and one of controversy over the commercialization of fear. Millions turn to him for guidance, comfort, and understanding of the divine, yet the wealth and power he accumulated behind the pulpit underscore the complex interplay of faith, influence, and human ambition. In the end, the preacher who warned the world of imminent doom also served as a reminder of how easily hope can be monetized when delivered from behind the mask of holiness. For more real-life stories of religious deception and shocking true crimes, subscribe now and stay tuned for the next deep dive into the hidden truths behind the pulpit.